Today we're talking to Dr. Samantha Mosier. She's a scientist at KBS who studies the soil. Welcome, Dr. Mosier.
Thank you.
So what are you studying now?
So I study soil carbon across many different landscapes here at KBS. So I don't study one particular system or one particular plant. I study how lots of plants affect the soil, and specifically soil carbon. And we're really interested in soil carbon for many, many reasons. So people think about soil carbon as helping with climate change. The more carbon that's in the soil, the less that's in the atmosphere, which can help with climate change. But also soil carbon has a lot of other benefits that maybe aren't as well known to other people. One thing that soil carbon can help do is it can help hold on to nutrients. So we think about nitrogen or phosphorus or all these other nutrients that the plants need to grow. Soil carbon can help maintain that in the soil. We also think about soil carbon as facilitating water in the soil. And so soil carbon can help the soil act like a sponge and absorb that water. So when we think of rainfall and all the water that plants need, soil carbon can help that situation as well. It does have some qualities that can help absorb pollution, but we kind of think of it as when plants, they take the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so one of the things that contributes to climate change, and it uses that carbon dioxide to build its plant biomass, so it uses it to grow. It uses it as a source of food. And then after the plant dies, or the turnover of the plant, a lot of that carbon will be returned to the soil. And so we think of it as like capturing that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and putting it in the soil, but it also can act as somewhat of a filter for pollution for sure, and keeping some of those nasty things out of our water system.
Wow, so soil carbon is really helpful to making sure our planet is clean and it's safe. So how did you become involved in studying soil?
Yeah, so I never really thought of soil as anything other than some dirt beneath my feet, probably until my undergraduate studies. And like I said, that first research project that I had done was based on soil, and I really didn't understand how the soil could make such a big impact of what can grow there and how productive those plants can be there. And when I started digging deeper and getting more into the research, I realized that it all comes back to the soil. It's responsible for so much of what we eat and the fuel we use in our cars. It's all really ties back to the soil. I can't think of one product I use or one thing I use in my daily life that doesn't have some relation back to the soil.
Yeah, I think it's so cool because a lot of people can just ignore what's going on beneath your feet, but there's actually kind of a whole world going on beneath your feet that has so much of an impact on everything that we do. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, so beneath your feet, you think of it as dirt, but a lot of the things I study are microscopic, so you can't see with your eye. You have to look a little bit closer, and so it takes a little bit of imagination to think about what all the life and activity that's going on beneath your feet.
Yeah, that's a great point. I didn't realize people are exploring space and finding new things out all over the world, but actually soil is one of the places where there's a lot to be discovered, especially under the microscope.
Sure. I think some people would argue that we know more about space than we actually know about the soil.
Isn't that wild?
It's
wild.
wild.
Wow. So what is your role? Like, are you a manager? What is your role in your project and in everyday work? Do you manage projects? Are you the one outside doing a lot of the field work? What kind of responsibilities do you have?
So one of the things I really love about my job is that not every day looks the same. So there's a lot of variety in my day. So some days I might be out in the field, out here like this. This is one of the plots that I do research on. This is switchgrass, which is a bioenergy crop. And so some days I might be here, digging in the soil, taking some samples. Other days I might be looking at those samples back in the lab and analyzing them for different properties. And other days I might be chatting with people like you or farmers or communicating this science to others. And so my day looks different every day, but yeah, it has a bit of managing a project and then eventually disseminating or dispersing that information out to many different outlets, to different researchers, to the public, things like that.
Super cool. I love how variable it is day to day.
Yeah, that's probably my favorite part.
Yeah.
I never get bored.
I think when I think of a scientist, you think of them in the lab all day working on a microscope or doing something very detailed in a lab. But really, when you're studying soil, you can be out and about everywhere. And also communicating science is really important. So that's awesome that you get to do that. So how does your research, I know you talked about this a bit before, but how does studying soil carbon relate to studying climate change, or more specifically, drought effects or rainfall effects like we've seen in Michigan this year? How does that help?
Yeah, definitely. So like I said, the soil kind of acts like a sponge. Mm-hmm. And so if there's a lot of soil carbon beneath your feet and in your plots where you're growing plants, you're going to be able to absorb a lot more of that water. So with these really intense rainfalls we've just been seeing, they come very quickly and a lot of rain at one time. It's not across a week. It's like all day, every day. Depending on how much soil carbon is there will determine how much of that water can actually be absorbed and maintained for plant uptake later on. And so if you don't have a lot of soil carbon and your soils are not healthy, a lot of that rainfall could just be washed right off the landscape and might run off, and along with it would take some of your healthy soil, but also some of those nutrients that those plants need. And so all of that water that was just dropped on the earth is no longer going to be available to those plants because it's going to have left the scene. But with that soil carbon, a lot more of that rainfall is able to be absorbed, and then those plants will be able to utilize that water later on when we're, for example, in a drought and there's not a lot of rainfall and we go through long periods of time with no rain. The soil carbon helps maintain that water throughout those dry periods.
Super cool. So just because it rains a lot doesn't mean that there's a ton of water for plants to use if there's not soil carbon regulating and helping keep that water in the soil.
Yeah, that's actually a really big problem that we have here in Michigan is that the soils are not able to absorb that water. So we also see it with flooding. A lot of that is because the soils are no longer absorbent and that water cannot infiltrate into deeper depths. And therefore those roots won't be able to suck up that water to feed the thirsty plant.
Yeah, wow. What's one of the most interesting things you've learned doing your research? Like, what's a result you found that is just like something you didn't expect?
Yeah, so I study what we call perennial systems, and so we have something that's called an annual system or a perennial system. Annual means it needs to be planted every year, and perennial means that it can come back year to year and does not need to be replanted every year. And that's the case here with switchgrass. It will last many years and just keep coming back and won't need to be planted. And thinking about all the disturbance that we use to plant annual crops such as corn, that can lose a lot of that soil carbon. So thinking about the role of these perennial crops and maybe how we can incorporate them into our everyday farming systems, I think is something that I've been exploring quite a bit more.
Wow, that's really cool. So instead of just planting rows of corn with soil in between, there's opportunity to include these perennial plants to help make the soils healthier.
Yeah, there's been a lot of research here at KBS that and elsewhere that shows that having something living in the soil at all times can be really beneficial specifically for soil carbon.
So why should someone care about the job that you have or the work that you do?
Yeah, well, I think that we're seeing more often every day that climate change affects everybody, and more and more is affecting more and more people. And to think about our food security in the future and how we're going to be able to maintain these crops and grow them in the future with climate change. So under these conditions, with more or less rainfall or less consistency in the rainfall at least, it has direct implications for how we get our food and how we live. Also, going back to that flooding aspect, flooding can be a big problem for anybody. And so if we have these healthy soils, we can reduce the flooding that goes on and have these soils absorb some of that extra rainfall and make it available later on to produce food. That's just one of the few reasons that we should care about soil carbon. But thinking about what you use every day in your life, if you can come up with something that maybe didn't come from the soil, I'd be curious to chat with you about it, because you know, you go through and you think about it, and everything starts from the ground, and so it affects everybody.
Yeah. My last question is, why is it important to study climate change? And it might be similar to other responses you've given, but with everything going on and the temperatures increasing and the oceans rising, there's so much happening in the world in terms of climate change. Why is it important to study that?
Yeah, I mean, since it's affecting every one of us in many negative ways, and we want to avoid that, or if we can't avoid it, how can we adapt to this changing climate? We need to understand what the climate might look like in the future. And so by studying climate change now, hopefully we'll be better prepared in the future to mitigate some of those effects of climate change. And then again, you know, thinking about food security in the future, and being able to produce all the food and fiber. So thinking of things like wood, for example, and also fuel. So all three of those things are going to be affected by climate change, and we need to better understand them so we can adapt.
Yeah, definitely. Great answers. Well, thank you so much for being interviewed, Dr. Mosier. It was a pleasure talking to you, and it's really interesting to learn about the work you do with soil carbon. Thank you.
Thanks. Always appreciate you asking about soil carbon. I'll talk about it all day.